December 14, 1990, 3:30 p.m. The piercing shriek of the shift whistle echoed across the Mississippi River, carrying a heavy, undeniable finality. Thousands of seasoned machinists walked away from the sprawling red brick factories of Rock Island Arsenal, their hands washed of grease and steel dust, leaving behind silent foundries that once forged the destiny of the free world. For decades, this island was an untouchable titan. At its absolute peak, nearly 19,000 men and women worked in relentless 24-hour shifts. They didn't just build weapons, they manufactured history, churning out the heavy artillery, howitzers, and armored behemoths that turned the tide of global conflicts. This single massive island fortress was the beating heart of America's industrial war machine, sustaining entire bloodlines of local families. But today, the deafening roar of the heavy drop forges has faded into a ghostly quiet. The vast, cavernous workshops that once dictated the fate of nations now sit largely hollow, reclaimed by shadows and silence. An industrial empire that commanded a small city's worth of workers has been reduced to a skeletal operation. How does the largest government-owned weapons manufacturing arsenal in the United States, an indestructible fortress shielded by the mighty Mississippi, crumble so completely? It wasn't destroyed by enemy bombers, foreign espionage, or technological failure. It was quietly dismantled by something far more clinical: the ruthless rise of private defense conglomerates, shifting political winds, and the fatal stroke of a pen in Washington boardrooms. Welcome to Rock Island Arsenal. This is the story of the hidden cost of peace, the privatization of war, and the slow, agonizing suffocation of a legendary industrial giant. Long before the deafening rhythm of drop forges and the heavy scent of molten steel defined its atmosphere, the island sitting squarely in the Mississippi River between Illinois and Iowa was a place of profound, almost reverent stillness. Known geographically as a 946-acre limestone outcrop, it was a natural sanctuary. For centuries, the river wrapped its powerful currents around the dense oak forests and rocky bluffs, acting as a silent witness to the changing seasons and the indigenous tribes who navigated its waters. But history, particularly the history of nations forged in conflict, rarely leaves such strategic ground undisturbed for long. In the mid-19th century, the United States was a nation ripping itself apart at the seams. It was the dawn of the Civil War, and the Union required secure, isolated locations to manage the grim logistics of a fratricidal conflict. In 1862, by an act of Congress signed by President Abraham Lincoln, the island's destiny was irrevocably altered. It was officially designated as the site for a national arsenal, but its immediate, urgent use was far darker. It became the Rock Island Prison Barracks. During those brutal winter months, the island was violently stripped of its innocence. Over 12,000 Confederate prisoners of war were confined to hastily constructed, drafty wooden barracks. The biting Midwestern wind sweeping off the frozen Mississippi proved as lethal as any battlefield. Disease, malnutrition, and bitter exposure claimed nearly 2,000 lives. The island's soil absorbed the sorrow of a divided nation, laying a somber, blood-steeped foundation for the industrial behemoth that was to follow. It was a harsh baptism, proving that this isolated patch of limestone could serve the uncompromising, often cruel demands of the federal government. As the smoke of the Civil War cleared, the true long-term vision for Rock Island began to materialize. The military recognized that the island's location was a logistical masterpiece. Protected by the deep, fast-flowing waters of the Mississippi, making it virtually immune to sudden overland attacks, and perfectly positioned near the expanding railroad networks of the burgeoning Midwest, it was the ideal incubator for a new kind of warfare: the war of mass production. Enter Major General Thomas J. Rodman, Arriving in 1865 to take command, Rodman was not merely a soldier, he was a visionary engineer with an appetite for monumental scale. He looked at the scarred, deforested remnants of the prison camp and envisioned an industrial utopia. Rodman master-planned a manufacturing complex that would not only serve the Army, but stand as a permanent, intimidating testament to American power. He completely discarded the idea of cheap, temporary wooden structures. Instead, he ordered the construction of massive, U-shaped manufacturing shops built from solid Joliet limestone. These were not mere factories, they were industrial cathedrals. Designed in the imposing Greek Revival style, the heavy stone blocks projected an aura of permanence, authority, and unyielding strength. Rodman's ambitious plan called for 10 magnificent stone shops, laid out with precise military symmetry, along 2 grand parallel avenues. The sheer scale of the undertaking was staggering for the 1860s. Hundreds of stonemasons, carpenters, and laborers descended upon the island, the sharp strikes of their chisels and hammers echoing across the water from dawn until dusk. At the heart of this transformation rose the iconic clock tower. Completed in 1867, it was the first permanent building of Rodman's grand design. Soaring 117 feet into the sky, the limestone monolith was crowned with a massive clock face that would soon dictate the lives of generations. The clock tower was more than a timepiece. It was the watchful eye of the establishment, an imposing sentinel that declared the island's transition from a natural wonder to a regimented machine. The mechanical ticking of its immense brass gears was the first pulse of a new, synthetic heartbeat. But a machine of this magnitude required a lifeblood far stronger than human muscle. It required the river itself. The arsenal's engineers turned their eyes to the mighty Mississippi, viewing it no longer as just a defensive moat, but as an inexhaustible motor. They constructed a massive water power dam, chaining the untamed currents to drive the heavy machinery inside the stone shops. The river, which had flowed freely since the last ice age, was now forced through turbines, belts, and massive water wheels. The local communities of Davenport, Rock Island, and Moline, the Quad Cities, watched this transformation with a mix of awe and economic hunger. The arsenal rapidly became the gravitational center of the entire region. Every morning, ferries carried hundreds of workers across the misty river, their daily lives now strictly tethered to the relentless ticking of the clock tower. Fathers began teaching sons the trades of the forge and the lathe, sparking a generational lineage of arsenal workers that would define the region's identity for the next century. Inside the cool, cavernous limestone walls, production lines began to hum, crafting saddles, canteens, and the meticulous metal components of military rifles. This was the fundamental tension that defined the island's new era. A ruthless, calculated subjugation of nature. The quiet rustle of oak leaves was permanently replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical thud of water-powered trip hammers. The crisp river air became thick with the smell of coal smoke, machine oil, and heated iron. The island was being hollowed out, reinforced, and rewired. By the turn of the 20th century, Rock Island had ceased to be an island in the natural sense. It was a fortress. It was a weapon. The government had successfully grafted an industrial spine onto the ancient limestone bedrock. The men and women walking through its heavy iron gates were no longer just assembling gear. They were greasing the cogs of a system designed to project power. The foundation was laid. The great stone walls were impenetrable. The mechanical infrastructure was in place. The sleeping giant had been carefully, meticulously constructed. All it needed now was a massive external shock to awaken its terrifying, full-scale potential, and that shock was already brewing across the Atlantic, preparing to plunge the world into the first great industrialized war. For decades, the stone leviathan on the Mississippi had hummed with a steady, predictable rhythm. It was a factory of peacetime preparation, turning out cavalry saddles, wooden canteens, and small arms with the deliberate precision of a master craftsman. But in the spring of 1917, the world across the Atlantic tore itself apart, and the United States was dragged into the mechanized slaughter of the First World War. Almost overnight, the steady hum of Rock Island Arsenal escalated into a deafening, frantic roar. The era of the meticulous artisan was abruptly severed. The brutal, unforgiving era of mass production had arrived. The federal government issued a mandate that defied the island's previous physical limits. Modern war required not hundreds, but millions of pieces of equipment. To meet this insatiable demand, the infrastructure of the island was pushed to its absolute breaking point. Trains groaning under the immense weight of raw steel, coal, and lumber rumbled across the river bridges at all hours of the day and night. The pristine, parallel avenues originally laid out by General Rodman were suddenly choked with a seemingly endless, chaotic tide of humanity and machinery. The workforce exploded. Where there had once been a few thousand steady hands, the island now absorbed a staggering influx of labor from across the Midwest. Farmers left their plows in the fields, clerks abandoned their city desks, and crucially, as millions of young men were shipped off to the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of Europe, women stepped onto the heavy factory floors in unprecedented numbers. The ferries crossing the Mississippi were packed shoulder to shoulder, carrying over 13,000 souls daily into the belly of the stone shops. Inside, the atmosphere was an overwhelming sensory assault. The air grew impossibly thick with the acrid smoke of continuously burning coal and the sharp, metallic tang of hot iron. Miles of raw leather were rapidly cut and stitched into heavy artillery harnesses. Rivers of molten lead and steel were cast into the brutal geometries of modern warfare. The island was no longer just producing supplies. It was attempting to outmanufacture an entire continent's capacity for destruction. This sudden, violent acceleration stripped away the individuality of the worker. The sheer scale of the operation meant that a machinist was no longer building a complete rifle from start to finish. They were endlessly repeating a single microscintquium, microscopic motion in the birthing process of 10,000 rifles. Men and women became living, breathing extensions of the water-powered lathes and drop forges. The Grand Clock Tower, once a symbol of orderly civic progress, now felt like a relentless taskmaster, its ticking brass gears demanding more speed, more sweat, and more output from the mortal bodies below. As the Great War finally drew to a close, the momentum of the island's industrial awakening could not simply be switched off. The machinery had grown too massive, the workforce too entrenched, and the government's appetite for mechanized supremacy had been permanently whetted. Recognizing the phenomenal heavy-lifting capability of what had been built, Washington pivoted the arsenal toward the production of something entirely new, something that would cement its reputation as a cathedral of heavy manufacturing, the tank. In the immediate aftermath of the armistice, the sprawling, grease-stained floors of Rock Island became the primary assembly ground for the Mark VIII Liberty tank. This was not a mere weapon. It was a 35-ton, armor-plated monster born directly from the nightmares of no man's land. Producing it required a level of heavy industrial coordination previously unseen in the region. The physical toll on the workers assembling these behemoths was immense. Manipulating the massive steel hull plates, driving thousands of white-hot rivets, and installing the colossal V-12 Liberty aircraft engines required Herculean effort. The noise inside the main assembly shops was absolute and unforgiving, a constant, concussive hammering that vibrated through the solid limestone walls and deep into the very bones of the men on the floor. To stand in the main bay was to be swallowed by a mechanical beast, communicating only through frantic hand signals and shouts that were instantly drowned out by the industrial thunder. Yet, amidst this grueling environment, a profound sociological shift was taking root. The arsenal was forging more than just armor. It was forging a fiercely proud, interconnected community. Working at Rock Island ceased to be merely a job. It became a bloodline. Entire families, generation after generation, began to bind their livelihoods and identities to the island. A grandfather might have laid the original limestone blocks, a father worked the lathes for infantry rifles, and now a son was riveting the armor of the Mark VIII. They derived a deep, almost mythical pride from knowing that their calloused, grease-stained hands were directly shaping the geopolitics of the globe. They were the anonymous, blue-collar muscle behind a rising global superpower. By 1920, as the last of the 100 Mark VIII tanks rolled heavily out of the shops, the island had forever transformed. It had proven beyond a doubt that it could mass-produce the most complex, terrifying machinery the military mind could dream up. But a dangerous precedent had been set. The island had tasted the intoxicating rush of total, unlimited production. It had grown into a voracious entity that required massive federal budgets, thousands of bodies, and the perpetual threat of global conflict just to sustain its own existence. The human workers, proud and fiercely loyal as they were, had unknowingly chained themselves to a colossal wheel that could never be allowed to stop turning. The true peak and the devastating pressure it would eventually bring was still on the horizon. The uneasy peace that settled over the world in the 1920s and 1930s forced Rock Island Arsenal into a state of quiet hibernation. The massive limestone shops, built to sustain the frantic output of a global conflict, echoed with the footsteps of a drastically reduced skeleton crew. Grass began to reclaim the edges of the rail yards, but this slumber was violently interrupted on a crisp Sunday morning in December 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor sent a shock wave across the Pacific, straight into the heart of the American Midwest. The sleeping giant on the Mississippi did not just wake up, it roared to life with a ferocity that would dwarf everything that had come before. The United States government instantly recognized that winning a multi-front war in Europe and the Pacific would require an unprecedented volume of heavy ordnance. Rock Island was ordered to shift into maximum overdrive. The response was a logistical miracle. Almost overnight, the island transformed from a quiet military installation into a dense, hyperactive industrial metropolis. At its absolute zenith during the Second World War, the workforce swelled to an astonishing 18,900 people. This was not merely a factory, it was a self-contained city operating entirely in the service of destruction. The arsenal boasted its own dedicated police force, a fully staffed fire department, an internal transit system, and cafeterias that served thousands of meals around the clock. The bridges connecting the island to the Quad Cities became arteries of continuous, heavy traffic, choked with buses, bicycles, and carpools carrying workers in relentless, overlapping shifts. The scale of production inside the heavy masonry walls was difficult to comprehend. The island became the nation's premier manufacturer of complex recoil mechanisms, the vital, highly engineered hydraulic shock absorbers that prevented heavy artillery pieces from tearing themselves apart upon firing. These were not crude iron castings. They required the precision of watchmaking applied to massive steel cylinders. Alongside these, the factory floors churned out thousands of carriages for the legendary 105mm howitzers and countless mounts for the M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. The physical environment was a crucible of sensory extremes. The sky above the island was permanently stained with the thick, black exhaust of coal-fired power plants pushing the electrical grid to its absolute limits. Inside, the temperature near the furnaces easily surpassed 100 degrees. even in the dead of the Midwestern winter. The air was a toxic mist of vaporized cutting fluids, hot oil, and metallic dust that coated the workers' skin and lungs. The noise was an uninterrupted, bone-rattling symphony of heavy drop hammers, screaming metal lathes, and the hiss of pneumatic presses. Operations ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The Great Clock Tower no longer just kept the time. It presided over an endless, punishing marathon of steel and sweat. To walk the floor of Rock Island Arsenal during the height of the Second World War was to witness the absolute pinnacle of state-owned manufacturing power. A profound psychological shift occurred within the workforce. The men and women of the Quad Cities, including thousands of women who had stepped into heavy industrial roles to replace the men sent overseas, felt a deep, visceral connection to the battlefields half a world away. Every time a newsreel played in the local cinemas showing American artillery pounding enemy positions in Normandy or the Pacific Islands, the workers in the dark theaters knew with absolute certainty that their blistered hands had built the machinery of that victory. They were not just employees earning a wage. They were the anonymous, indispensable heartbeat of the Allied war effort. They possessed a swagger, a fierce regional pride that bordered on invincibility. They genuinely believed that as long as the United States needed a shield, Rock Island would be the eternal forge. But it was precisely here, at the dizzying heights of its maximum output, that the seeds of the arsenal's eventual downfall were quietly sown. The island had grown too large, too specialized, and too hungry. It had evolved into a specialized organism that could only survive in the extreme ecosystem of total war. A massive, government-owned facility of this magnitude operates entirely outside the normal laws of supply and demand. It does not compete for market share. It is fed exclusively by astronomical defense budgets and the geopolitical necessity of conflict. As the tide of the war began to turn in favor of the Allies, an unspoken, invisible tension began to creep into the administrative offices above the factory floors. The engineers and military planners looking at the production charts could see the terrifying reality approaching. They had built an industrial leviathan capable of equipping millions of soldiers, an infrastructure that supported the entire economic foundation of the surrounding region. But what would happen when the Axis powers finally surrendered? The massive drop forges, the miles of assembly lines, and the nearly 19,000 workers were all accelerating toward a brick wall called peace. The island had achieved its greatest glory, mastering the art of mass-producing the tools of global survival. Yet it had completely failed to realize that a machine designed to run at maximum velocity cannot simply be shifted into neutral without tearing itself apart. The highest peak had been reached, but the air was getting perilously thin, and the inevitable descent was going to be brutal. When the dust of the Second World War finally settled, the inevitable crash that the engineers at Rock Island Arsenal had feared seemed to materialize. Production lines ground to a halt. The deafening roar of the drop forges subsided to an eerie murmur, and thousands of workers were sent home, carrying the heavy realization that their wartime purpose had abruptly expired. But the geopolitical tectonic plates were already shifting. The brief, fragile illusion of global peace shattered in 1950 with the outbreak of the Korean War, plunging the United States into a new, icy standoff. The sleeping giant on the Mississippi was jolted violently awake once again. The federal government, suddenly facing the looming threat of Soviet expansion, ordered the island to spin up its massive machinery. The old, familiar rhythm of 24-hour shifts returned to the Quad Cities. The foundries roared back to life, casting heavy components for the new M47 and M48 Patton tanks and churning out field artillery to be shipped across the Pacific. To the machinists walking through the heavy limestone gates, breathing in the familiar scent of ozone and cutting fluid, It felt like the glory days of the 1940s had been seamlessly resurrected. The paychecks were steady, the local economy boomed, and the deep-seated pride of being the nation's premier armory was fiercely rekindled. However, beneath the surface of this renewed industrial frenzy, a quiet, insidious shift was occurring, one that the massive mechanical drop hammers could not simply beat into submission. The very nature of warfare was evolving at a terrifying speed. The Second World War had been won by sheer, overwhelming mechanical volume, by pouring more steel, oil, and explosive force onto the battlefield than the enemy. Rock Island was the undisputed master of this brutal, heavy arithmetic. But the new era, the Cold War, was governed by an entirely different set of rules. The skies were now dominated by swept-wing jet fighters, and the strategic high ground was being claimed by long-range ballistic missiles and the terrifying, existential specter of the atomic bomb. War was no longer just about heavy iron and precise mechanical tolerances. It was rapidly becoming a domain of advanced electronics, aerospace engineering, and complex guidance systems. The massive, water-powered machine shops of General Rodman's era, built to churn out cast-iron howitzer carriages, were fundamentally at odds with the delicate demands of the atomic age. The arsenal's leadership found themselves facing an invisible, impenetrable wall. They possessed an unmatched historic capacity to bend and shape heavy steel, but the military was increasingly asking for silicon, wiring, and radar arrays. The island was essentially a colossal, perfectly tuned mechanical clock, operating in an era that was rapidly transitioning to the microchip. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the grinding jungle conflict in Vietnam provided yet another massive surge in demand for the arsenal's traditional products. The island churned out M16 rifle components, intricate aircraft weapon subsystems, and helicopter armaments at a blistering pace. Yet this intense burst of activity was a deceptive mask, covering a deep and accelerating structural decay. The massive limestone buildings, though visually magnificent and seemingly indestructible from the outside, were aging rapidly on the inside. The infrastructure required constant, wildly expensive maintenance, and the heavy machinery, while robust, lacked the precise nimbleness required for cutting-edge technological integration. The workers on the floor felt this friction intimately. They were master machinists, generational craftsmen who could shave a block of steel down to 1,000th of an inch using pure instinct and a vibrating manual lathe. But the blueprints coming down from the Department of Defense were changing drastically. The military was pivoting its focus towards smart weapons, laser-guided munitions, automated tracking, and computer-assisted targeting systems. Rock Island Arsenal was repeatedly bypassed for these lucrative high-tech contracts because its sprawling, grease-stained floors simply weren't built for assembling fragile circuitry. It was a heavyweight bare-knuckle boxer stepping into a ring where the rules had suddenly changed to a surgical fencing match. A deep, unspoken anxiety began to permeate the factory floors. The men and women of the Quad Cities, whose families had bled and sweated for the arsenal for nearly a century, realized that their unparalleled work ethic was no longer enough to guarantee their survival. You could not manually hammer out a microprocessor. You could not cast a radar guidance system in a 100-degree foundry. The psychological toll of this realization was heavy and suffocating. The workers were still performing at maximum capacity, sacrificing their hearing and their lungs to the factory, yet they were acutely aware that the world was accelerating away from them, leaving their heavy industrial skills in the dust. Furthermore, the political climate in Washington was shifting drastically. The agonizing length and ultimate failure of the Vietnam War led to a profound public and political backlash against the military-industrial complex. Defense budgets were being scrutinized with a newfound cynical intensity. The sheer astronomical cost of maintaining a massive government-owned manufacturing city on an island in the Mississippi River was becoming a glaring target for politicians looking to trim federal spending. The Cold War had sustained the arsenal, feeding it just enough localized conflict to keep the furnaces burning. But it had also introduced the very technologies that would render its core capabilities obsolete. The island had successfully weathered the brutal transition from cavalry horses to armored tanks, but it was violently stuttering on the precipice of the electronic age. As the 1970s drew to a close, the mighty Rock Island Arsenal was no longer the undisputed, invincible king of defense manufacturing. It was an aging, expensive dinosaur, entirely dependent on a government that was beginning to look elsewhere for its weapons. The true threat to the island's survival was no longer a lack of global war. It was the arrival of the corporate boardroom. As the calendar turned to the 1980s, the Cold War entered a dramatic, highly funded new phase. The United States government, under the Reagan administration, initiated one of the largest peacetime military buildups in history. Defense budgets skyrocketed, and a river of federal money flowed into the procurement of new weaponry. By all traditional logic, Rock Island Arsenal, the crown jewel of government-owned manufacturing, should have experienced a glorious renaissance. The limestone fortress should have been vibrating with the energy of 1,000 new contracts. But the island remained disturbingly quiet. The rules of engagement in Washington had fundamentally, irreversibly changed. The era of the government-owned, government-operated GOGO facility was quietly being dismantled. In its place rose the modern titans of the private defense industry, massive, sprawling conglomerates whose names would soon dominate global geopolitics. These private corporations did not just build weapons. They built incredibly sophisticated political ecosystems. They deployed armies of highly paid lobbyists to pace the marble halls of the Capitol, armed with glossy presentations, political campaign contributions, and the seductive modern promise of cost efficiency through total privatization. The strategy was simple but devastatingly effective. Convince lawmakers that the private sector could innovate faster, shoulder the financial risks of research and development, and deliver lethal systems cheaper than a sprawling, aging government facility. Washington listened, and the paradigm shifted. The Pentagon became increasingly enamored with the agility and financial structuring of private defense contractors. Rock Island Arsenal, isolated on its ancient bedrock in the middle of the Mississippi River, had no lobbyists. It had no political action committees or slick public relations teams. It only had its history, its massive red brick foundries, and its multi-generational blue-collar workforce. The men and women of the Quad Cities were suddenly forced into a geopolitical game to which they did not know the rules. They stubbornly believed that unparalleled quality, rugged durability, and a century of loyal service were enough to secure their future. They thought their work spoke for itself. But in the new era of defense procurement, a flawless artillery carriage meant very little if it didn't come attached to a politically advantageous corporate strategy. The sting of this corporate invasion was felt sharply and personally on the factory floor. Master machinists, who had spent decades perfecting the dense metallurgy of howitzer barrels and tank armor, watched in absolute disbelief as lucrative contracts were systematically awarded to private firms hundreds of miles away. It was not a matter of competence. No private contractor could match the sheer, brute force institutional knowledge possessed by the Rock Island workforce. The island was losing because it was structurally disadvantaged in the new corporate bidding wars. To keep the massive arsenal running, the overhead costs were staggering. The military had to factor in the price of maintaining miles of aging 19th century infrastructure, paying federal pensions, heating cavernous stone buildings in the bitter Midwestern winters, and maintaining a self-contained island ecosystem. Private companies, unburdened by historic architecture, were building sleek, modern facilities in states with cheaper, non-unionized labor and aggressive tax incentives. They could consistently undercut the arsenal's production estimates on paper. Consequently, the island began to suffer a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts. An order for vehicle armor went to a private contractor in the south. A lucrative contract for artillery recoil mechanisms was outsourced to a tech-heavy firm on the coast. Inside the great stone shops of Rock Island, the colossal drop forges began to fall silent. Not all at once in a dramatic shutdown, but one by one, week by week. A profound, suffocating sense of betrayal settled over the Quad Cities. The workforce, a fiercely proud lineage of mechanics and engineers who viewed themselves as the literal shield of the Republic, realized they were not being defeated by a foreign adversary or a lack of global demand. They were being outmaneuvered by corporate executives in tailored suits who had never poured a molten mold, never deafened themselves on a rivet line, and never breathed in the metallic dust of a machine shop. The impenetrable fortress that had withstood the staggering, unrelenting demands of total war was now being effortlessly breached by the invisible, relentless forces of free market capitalism and political maneuvering. The giant was no longer sleeping. It was being actively starved of its lifeblood. The corporate boardroom had replaced the battlefield as the ultimate arbiter of the island's fate, setting the stage for a demographic and industrial tragedy that would forever alter the region. In November 1989, the world watched in stunned, joyous disbelief as the Berlin Wall was torn down by ordinary citizens armed with sledgehammers and pickaxes. The Soviet Union, the great existential adversary that had defined American foreign policy and defense spending for nearly half a century, was rapidly collapsing under its own weight. Across the globe, politicians heralded the dawn of a new, peaceful epoch. But on the limestone island, sitting in the middle of the Mississippi River, the triumphant end of the Cold War was met with a chilling, unspoken dread. For Rock Island Arsenal, peace was not a victory lap. Peace was the ultimate catastrophe. In the darkly ironic logic of the military-industrial complex, winning the war was the worst business outcome imaginable. The arsenal had been designed, expanded, and sustained by the perpetual threat of global annihilation. Now, with the Red Menace dissolving into a fragmented map of struggling republics, the Pentagon found itself sitting on a colossal stockpile of weaponry and an infrastructure it no longer needed. The massive defense budgets that had flowed like a swollen river during the Reagan years evaporated almost overnight. Washington's solution was swift, clinical, and devastating. The Base Realignment and Closure Brassey Commission. This was a bureaucratic reaper, an independent panel armed with spreadsheets, efficiency metrics, and a mandate to aggressively trim the fat from the nation's bloated military infrastructure. When the BRAC auditors turned their calculating gaze toward the Midwest, Rock Island Arsenal was a glaring red flag on their ledgers. To a spreadsheet in a Pentagon office, the poetry of the island meant absolutely nothing. The auditors did not see the historic 19th century limestone shops that General Rodman had built to endure for a millennium. They saw wildly inefficient, drafty structures that cost a fortune in heating bills and routine maintenance. They did not see the multi-generational lineage of master craftsmen who could coax miracles out of raw steel. They saw a bloated, expensive federal payroll burdened with union protections and legacy pensions. The corporate defense contractors possessing sleek, modern facilities and aggressive lobbying arms had already siphoned away the advanced technological contracts. Now, the BRAC Commission arrived to harvest whatever was left. The island was systematically stripped of its core missions. Production lines that had run hot since the Korean War were unceremoniously ordered to shut down. The massive drop forges, the roaring heartbeats of the factory floor, were deactivated. their immense steel jaws resting silently against their anvils for the first time in decades. The island was no longer a weapon. It had been reclassified as an administrative liability. The execution of the downsizing was a slow-motion trauma for the Quad Cities. It was not a single, catastrophic explosion, but a relentless, agonizing bleeding out. The military euphemism for the devastation was reduction in force, or RIF. To the workers, it simply meant the end of their world. The pink slips arrived in waves, delivered with cold administrative precision to men and women whose families had given their lungs, their hearing, and their youth to the foundries. There is a specific, profound heartbreak in being discarded by the very system you spent your life protecting. These were machinists who possessed an almost mythical pride in their craft, people who genuinely believed that as long as their hands were stained with grease, the Republic was safe. Now they were being told that their hands, their skills, and their loyalty were simply too expensive to maintain. The scenes at the factory gates during the early 1990s were steeped in a quiet, devastating grief. Fathers and sons, who had proudly carpooled across the Mississippi River bridges together for years, walked out of the heavy iron gates carrying cardboard boxes of personal tools, looking back at the towering clock tower not with pride, but with a hollow, uncomprehending stare. They were stepping out of a structured, highly purposed universe and into a terrifying post-industrial void. The local economy of the Quad Cities, which had been inextricably tethered to the arsenal's payroll for over a century, absorbed the shock wave violently. Diners emptied, local supply shops shuttered, and a heavy, suffocating gloom settled over the river valley. Inside the island fortress, the physical transformation was eerie. The sprawling, cavernous bays of the manufacturing shops, once vibrating with the deafening 95-decibel roar of thousands of workers and machines, were swallowed by an unnatural, echoing silence. Millions of dollars worth of heavy lathes and milling machines were sprayed with protective cosmoline, draped in heavy canvas tarps, and left in the dark, ghostly monuments to a bygone era of heavy iron. The island had survived the agonizing transitions between horse-drawn artillery, mechanized tanks, and the atomic age. But it could not survive the lethal combination of global peace and corporate efficiency. The workforce was slashed to a fraction of its former glory, reducing the bustling, self-contained industrial metropolis to a quiet, skeleton-crewed administrative hub. The giant had not been slain in glorious combat. It had been systematically starved, stripped of its muscle, and left to slowly wither within its impenetrable limestone walls. The great engines of democracy had been turned off, and the silence they left behind was deafening. The dawn of the 21st century found Rock Island Arsenal existing in a state of suspended animation. The brutal, unforgiving downsizing of the 1990s had hollowed out its core, leaving behind a sprawling, ghostly campus of empty limestone buildings and dormant foundries. To the administrative staff and the heavily reduced crew of specialized machinists who remained, the island felt less like a vital military installation and more like a beautifully maintained industrial museum. The great heartbeat of the Quad Cities had slowed to a faint, erratic pulse, but the unpredictable, chaotic nature of global conflict had one final, desperate task for the old stone giant. Following the attacks of September 11, 2001, the United States military plunged into the grueling, asymmetric battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. It quickly became terrifyingly apparent that traditional, unarmored Humvees were woefully vulnerable to a new, devastating threat: improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. American soldiers were dying not in open infantry combat, but on routine logistics patrols along dusty desert highways. The Pentagon, facing an escalating tactical crisis and mounting public pressure, panicked. They needed heavy steel, cut and welded to incredibly precise specifications, and they needed it immediately. They needed the very thing Rock Island had been doing better than anyone else for a century. For a brief, intense window, the island awoke from its reluctant slumber. The surviving factory floors flared back to life with a familiar, urgent energy. The remaining master machinists, many of whom had narrowly survived the BRAC layoffs of the previous decade, were tasked with manufacturing massive quantities of add-on armor kits and objective gunner protection kits, OGPK, for the vulnerable vehicles. The island's heavy presses, laser cutters, and welding torches worked furiously to churn out thick ballistic glass housings and reinforced steel blast plates. To a casual observer watching the supply trucks cross the Mississippi bridges, the sudden influx of raw materials and the return of overlapping shifts might have looked like a glorious resurrection. It felt, for a fleeting, intoxicating moment, like the heroic days of the Second World War. The workers poured their sweat and souls into the heavy armor plating, knowing intimately that every perfectly laid weld directly translated to an American life saved in the desert. They were, once again, the literal physical shield of the Republic. But inside the administrative offices overlooking the floors, the reality was starkly, painfully clear. This was a false dawn. The surge in production was a frantic stopgap measure, a temporary reaction to an unforeseen insurgency, not a return to foundational heavy manufacturing. The arsenal was not building new fleets of tanks or field artillery from the ground up. It was merely retrofitting existing vehicles with bolted-on survival gear. Furthermore, the scale of this effort, while crucial to the war effort, utilized only a fraction of the island's historical footprint. The majority of the colossal stone shops remained locked and shrouded in darkness. As the wars in the Middle East eventually shifted phases and the emergency armor quotas were met, the lucrative contracts dried up just as quickly as they had arrived. The brief, fiery pulse of adrenaline faded, leaving the island to face a silence far deeper and more permanent than ever before. When the last of the Humvee armor shipments rolled off the island, the true, inescapable reality of the modern era settled heavily over Rock Island Arsenal. The golden age of mass-producing heavy iron through massive government-owned facilities was officially, irreversibly, dead. The sprawling red brick and limestone shops, originally envisioned by General Rodman to operate for 1,000 years, were now undeniably obsolete monoliths in a world that had moved on. Walking through the historic manufacturing avenues today is an exercise in profound, eerie contrast. Buildings that once comfortably absorbed the labor of over 18,000 workers now echo hollowly with the footsteps of a few hundred. The massive, cavernous assembly bays, once vibrating with a concussive 95-decibel roar that could rattle the teeth in a man's skull, are swallowed by a heavy, cathedral-like silence. The sharp scent of vaporized coolant, hot oil, and molten steel, the perfume of the industrial 20th century, has been completely replaced by the dry, musty smell of undisturbed dust and aging concrete. In the deepest, darkest corners of the inactive shops, millions of dollars worth of heavy industrial machinery sit utterly dormant. Colossal drop forges, massive hydraulic stamping presses, and rows of heavy-duty lathes are coated in thick amber cosmoline to prevent rust, meticulously draped under heavy canvas tarps. They look like sleeping mechanical beasts, carefully preserved for a conventional, mechanized World War III that military strategists know will likely never come. The modern battlefield is now dominated by unmanned drones, cyber warfare, and hypersonic missiles, fragile, highly advanced weapons born in sterile corporate laboratories and silicon clean rooms, not forged in the blistering 100-degree heat of a Midwestern foundry. Nature, sensing the final retreat of human industrial ambition, has begun a slow, patient reclamation of the fortress. Vines of ivy creep up the sides of the 19th century limestone, softening the rigid military symmetry of the architecture. The great clock tower still stands tall against the sky, its immense brass gears still mechanically tracking the hours, but it no longer dictates the frantic, sweaty rhythm of an industrial army. It simply watches the Mississippi River flow by, a silent, imposing sentinel guarding a vast graveyard of American manufacturing. The true ghosts of the factory floor are not supernatural. They are the lingering, heavy memories of the multi-generational workforce that once gave this island its magnificent soul. In the quiet bays, you can almost feel the presence of the men and women who riveted the Mark 8 tanks, who machined the howitzer barrels, and who proudly sacrificed their hearing to the rhythm of the drop hammers. They built the heavy tools that literally shaped the borders of the modern world, only to watch their vital, lifelong trade be outsourced, privatized, and ultimately rendered a relic. The island stands as a breathtakingly beautiful, deeply melancholic monument to their labor, a colossal, silent tombstone marking the absolute end of the American heavy industrial age. If you were to stand on the banks of the Mississippi River today and look across the water at Rock Island, you might not immediately recognize the scale of its industrial demise. Unlike the decaying, rust-eaten skeletons of abandoned auto plants in Detroit or the collapsed steel mills of Pennsylvania, the arsenal does not look like a graveyard from the outside. The grass is meticulously manicured, the limestone facades are kept clean, and a steady stream of commuter traffic still flows across the government bridge every weekday morning. The island has not been erased from the map. It has not been handed back to nature entirely. But to mistake this lingering activity for a continuation of its historic legacy is a profound illusion. Rock Island Arsenal did not die. Instead, it underwent a radical, almost surgical mutation. When the heavy manufacturing base was gutted by privatization and defense downsizing, the federal government had to figure out what to do with millions of square feet of historic, structurally sound real estate. The solution was to transform the island from the muscular, sweating heart of the military-industrial complex into its bureaucratic nervous system. Today, the island is primarily an administrative headquarters. It is home to the 1st Army and several major sustainment and logistics commands. The colossal stone buildings, originally designed by General Rodman to house roaring foundries and massive assembly lines, have been internally sanitized. The beautiful, rough-hewn limestone walls and towering vaulted ceilings have been hidden behind thousands of square feet of drywall, drop ceilings, and fluorescent lighting. Where tens of thousands of grease-stained machinists once swung heavy hammers and wrestled with molten steel, thousands of military personnel and civilian contractors now sit silently in seas of beige cubicles, staring at computer monitors. They manage global supply chains, negotiate with the very private defense contractors that rendered the island obsolete, and route digital paperwork. The island has successfully preserved its relevance by becoming a massive administrative brain, but in doing so, it has permanently amputated its own physical muscle. The environment is climate-controlled, quiet, and perfectly sterile, an absolute inversion of the chaotic, blistering, deafening reality that defined the space for over a century. Yet buried deep within this sprawling administrative campus, a faint, unrecognizable pulse of manufacturing does still survive. The Joint Manufacturing and Technology Center, JMTC, maintains a footprint on the island, but the nature of its work would be utterly incomprehensible to the ghosts of the Mark 8 tank builders. There are no more rivers of liquid iron or concussive drop forges shaking the bedrock. Instead, the surviving manufacturing sector is defined by additive manufacturing, industrial 3D printing. In pristine, dust-free rooms, technicians in clean white lab coats and safety glasses monitor robotic arms and high-tech extruders that silently build specialized drone brackets or custom titanium replacement parts, layer by microscopic layer. The deafening roar of the 20th century has been replaced by the high-pitched, steady hum of cooling fans and servos. This modern capability is highly advanced, undeniably crucial for producing small-batch specialized components that private corporations refuse to make because they aren't profitable. But it is fundamentally boutique. It requires a few dozen highly educated engineers with degrees in computer science and advanced metallurgy, not an army of 15,000 blue-collar workers. And this is where the true, lasting tragedy of Rock Island's survival comes into sharp focus. The island still breathes, but the cultural and economic ecosystem it once supported in the Quad Cities has been irreparably shattered. The generational pipeline of working-class prosperity has been permanently severed. A young man or woman growing up in Davenport or Moline today no longer looks at the clock tower across the river and sees a guaranteed lifelong career that can buy a home and raise a family without a college degree. The deeply ingrained Midwestern pride of being a master machinist, of possessing the raw, physical skill to bend heavy iron to the will of democracy, has been rendered economically extinct. The island exists today as a patient on a highly sophisticated bureaucratic life support system. It is kept alive by federal funding and administrative necessity, serving a vital logistical purpose for the modern military. But the soul of the place, the staggering unified human effort that could pull a nation out of a depression and arm the free world through sheer, brute force labor, is gone forever. The surviving pulse is steady, but it is cold, quiet, and profoundly alone in the massive stone corridors of a bygone era. To fully grasp the sprawling, complex legacy of Rock Island Arsenal, one must zoom out from the silent foundries and the empty limestone corridors and view the island through the unforgiving, objective lens of time. The story of this 946-acre outcrop of rock in the middle of the Mississippi River is not merely a localized history of a Midwestern factory, it is the ultimate American industrial tragedy, a perfect, encapsulated metaphor for the rise, the towering hubris, and the inevitable, agonizing decay of the 20th century manufacturing empire. For over a century, the United States government treated this island as a sacred forge. It was a place where the abstract, often terrifying geopolitical ambitions of a rising superpower were translated into heavy, tangible reality. The arsenal was the literal, physical manifestation of the phrase arsenal of democracy. It proved that with enough raw material, enough coal, and enough unyielding human labor, a single concentrated point on the map could project lethal power to the furthest, darkest corners of the globe. From the muddy trenches of the Western Front, across the beaches of Normandy, and deep into the jungles of Vietnam, the invisible fingerprints of the Quad Cities workforce were pressed into the steel that violently shaped the borders of the modern world. But the legacy of Rock Island is also a harsh, undeniable lesson in the fragility of even the most massive, supposedly permanent human endeavors. The brilliant engineers and generals who designed the magnificent, monolithic stone shops in the 19th century genuinely believed they were building for eternity. They constructed limestone walls thick enough to withstand direct artillery fire, operating under the assumption that the need for heavy, state-owned manufacturing would never waver. They failed to anticipate that the greatest threat to their impenetrable fortress would not arrive by land, sea, or air. It would arrive through the silent, invisible, and far more lethal forces of technological paradigm shifts and corporate lobbying. The tragedy of the arsenal is inextricably bound to the tragedy of the American working class. For generations, the island offered a profound, reciprocal covenant to the people living on the riverbanks. Give us your youth, your muscle, and your physical endurance, and in return, we will give you lifelong security, a stable middle-class existence, and the deep, abiding pride of knowing you are defending the Republic. When the federal government pivoted toward private defense contractors, choosing the sleek, ruthless agility of corporate boardrooms over the heavy, unionized reliability of the public sector, that covenant was permanently, violently broken. The families who had tethered their bloodlines to the ticking of the clock tower were left economically stranded. They were forced to learn the bitter modern truth that generational loyalty is rarely a line item on a corporate balance sheet. The silence that now blankets the island is not a peaceful one. It is a heavy, pregnant silence, thick with the unsaid goodbyes of thousands of workers. When the massive drop hammers were finally shut down, they did not just stop shaping steel, they stopped shaping the cultural identity of Davenport, Moline, and Rock Island. The visceral, deeply Midwestern pride of being a master machinist, of possessing the raw, tactile skill to bend heavy iron to the will of democracy, has been rendered largely obsolete, replaced by a world that values coding and outsourced supply chains over calloused hands. Today, the privatization of war is absolute. The weapons that define current global conflicts are no longer born in the blistering 100-degree heat of a government foundry. They are conceptualized in sterile corporate tech campuses and assembled in heavily guarded private facilities, driven by quarterly earnings and shareholder profit margins as much as by national defense. Rock Island Arsenal stands as the last magnificent fossil of an era when war was a collective, nationalized industrial burden. It is a haunting monument to a time when a community could physically, collectively, build its own defense. The transition from heavy iron to silicon, from government ownership to private enterprise, was perhaps an inevitable, unavoidable evolution of capitalism and warfare. But walking past the vast, darkened assembly bays today, it is impossible not to mourn what was lost in that cold transition. The sheer, collective human spirit that once animated this island cannot be replicated by an algorithm, a lobbyist, or an industrial 3D printer. Ultimately, the island remains exactly where it has always been, firmly anchored to the bedrock. The great limestone buildings, slowly surrendering their sharp corners to the creeping ivy and the quiet passage of decades, have become beautiful, melancholic mausoleums of the heavy industrial age. And wrapping around it all, completely indifferent to the frantic rise and fall of human empires, the mighty Mississippi River continues to flow. It powered the great water wheels that sparked the island's birth. It carried the immense weight of the raw steel that fed its peak, and it will continue to carve its path long after the final brass gear in the clock tower rusts into eternal silence. The river remains a constant, humbling reminder that no matter how much iron we forge, and no matter how impenetrable the fortresses we build, time and nature always reclaim the final word. The story of Rock Island Arsenal is more than just the rise and fall of a military facility. It is a profound reflection on the evolution of American power, the shifting landscape of global economics, and the heavy, often unseen price of progress. For over a century, the towering limestone walls of this island fortress echoed with a singular, unifying purpose. It was a place where ordinary men and women from the Quad Cities literally forged the shield of their nation with calloused hands, molten steel, and an unbreakable resolve. They built an empire of iron that dictated the course of global history, sustained by a deep-seated, fiercely proud belief that their physical labor kept the free world safe. But as the nature of warfare shifted from heavy artillery to microchips, and as the economic philosophy of the nation ruthlessly pivoted from government-owned reliability to privatized corporate efficiency, the mighty engines on the Mississippi were quietly suffocated. The true tragedy here is not merely the silencing of the massive drop forges, it is the breaking of a generational covenant. When the lucrative contracts moved to distant tech hubs and anonymous corporate boardrooms, a vital, irreplaceable piece of the American working-class identity was simply left behind to rust. Today, the massive brick and stone cathedrals of General Rodman's grand vision stand as beautiful, haunting monuments to an industrial era that will never return. The island technically survives, but the raw, deafening soul of the giant has vanished, replaced by the quiet, sterile hum of administrative servers and isolated 3D printers. Meanwhile, the Mississippi River continues its eternal, powerful flow around the limestone cliffs, entirely indifferent to the fading echoes of the 20th century's greatest manufacturing machine. It serves as a humbling reminder that all empires, no matter how deeply rooted in stone and steel, eventually surrender to the relentless currents of time. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of America's forgotten industrial titan. What do you think happens to a nation when it loses the physical capacity to forge its own defense? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you appreciate these deep dives into the forgotten corners of our industrial history, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It truly helps us keep these stories alive. Until next time, keep looking past the silence.